Now we will discuss about concurrency control. So concurrency control is one of the major functions of DBMS, which is entrusted to its component called as Concurrency Control Manager. So basically, concurrency control implies controlling of the execution of concurrent transaction in such a way that the resulting schedules are recoverable. So what is the goal of this concurrency control mechanism? High degree of concurrency among the transaction in a schedule and recoverability of schedules are two opposing requirements. So the goal of concurrency control scheme is that the generated schedules are serializable and cascadeless, while at the same time ensuring high degree of concurrency as much as possible. Now in this session we will be discussing about two different protocols. Now the first protocol that will help us in concurrency is called as a log based protocol, and the other one is the timestamp ordering protocol. So what is this log? We'll take a small example about logs. Okay, we'll consider an example of a college library. Now, when you take a book from the library, a student 1 takes a book from the library. So basically what happens over here is, this book is accessible to all the students in the college. Okay, so student 2 to student n is having an access to this book, can use this book. But when student 1 issues this book, that means this student is having an exclusive right over this particular book. So basically this student is applying a lock on this book. So this book can be only read by student 1 and is not accessible to any other student. So when we will say that we apply an unlock, when this book is returned back to the library, so we can say that an unlock operation has been performed on this particular book. A return of this book to the library gives an access to the other students in the college. So basically when the student issues this book, it is a lock operation. The book is only accessible to student 1, and when returned, it is an unlock operation, and now it is accessible to any number of students. So basically this is the concept that we will be using in terms of concurrency control. Okay. So basically a lock is a variable which is associated with a data item. You remember that when we went through some schedules, we had some data items like read data item A, write data item B, and so on. So a lock will be associated to this data items. That describes the status of this item with respect to the possible operations that can be carried out. So the basic operations will be like either perform a read operation, write operation, whether this particular database item is accessible or not accessible. Now what is this lock based protocol? So we'll try and understand an overview of this log based protocol. So we have, in this log based protocol, where a concurrent transaction Ti needs to access a shared data item Q, it will first get a lock on the data item in an appropriate mode and then access the data item. The granting of requested lock to transactions is controlled by the concurrency control manager. Now for accessing this data item Q, transaction Ti will proceed as follows. Step number 1, transaction Ti will request concurrency control manager to grant a lock on data item Q in an appropriate mode. So let's assume that the mode is M. In the second step, the concurrency control manager will examine whether the requested lock on Q can be granted to TI immediately or not. This decision is made on the basis of the current locking state of the database item Q. If Q is currently free, that means no lock exists on Q, or is currently locked in a mode which is compatible with mode M requested by transaction TI, then the requested lock on Q is immediately granted to transaction TI. Else, TI is made to wait till it is feasible to grant the requested lock. Step number 3, transaction TI will execute its next instruction only after the requested lock is granted. Step number 4, after TI has finished with Q, it will release the lock on Q. Now this change in the locking state of Q may make it possible for the concurrency control manager to grant lock on Q to some other waiting transactions. And finally, in step number 5, if transaction TI fails its execution before releasing its locks, then all the unreleased locks will be automatically released when transaction TI is rolled back. So basically this is an overview about the lock-based protocol. So all these operations are explained in the next slide. Step number 1, step number 2, 3, 4 and 5. Coming to the first type of locks. So the first type of lock is called as the binary lock. So as the name itself suggests, binary, there are only two values, 1 and 0. 1 indicates that a lock is already applied on the database item, and 0 indicates that the database item is unlocked and is free to be used. Now two operations, that is lock item and unlock items, are used with the binary locking. A transaction requests an access to an item X by first issuing a lock item X. This is the database item X operation. Now if the lock X is equals to 1, if the value of the database item is 1, that means the transaction will be forced to wait. That means some other transaction is already using the database item X. Whereas if the value is 0, then it will be set to 1. And then the transaction will be allowed to use it. Now when the transaction is done using the database item, then it has to perform an unlock operation so that it releases that particular database item to be used by other transactions. Here we have a pseudocode of the lock item and the unlock item. So when you want to apply a lock, you will first check if the value of lock is equals to 0. If it is 0, you make it 1. Else, you wait until the value of X becomes 0. With respect to unlock item, when the value of lock item is equals to 0, that means no operation is using the database item X, and if there are any other transactions in a queue waiting for that particular database item, they can have an access to that item. There's something called as a lock table. Now this lock table keeps information about each and every data item. So now what are the parameters that it keeps track of? It keeps track of the database item name. For example, it might be database item A, B, X and so on. We have seen in our previous example. Which is the locking transaction, whether it is transaction T1, T2 and Tn. And what is the lock, whether the lock is 1 or whether the lock is 0. So this information is kept in the lock table.